mic here. Thank you, Katrin. I'd like to introduce our guests then for our next panel. Ajay Mathur is the Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute in New Delhi. Thank you very much for coming. Hans-Jörn Weddige is the Energy, Climate, and Environmental Policy Coordinator for thyssenkrupp. Thank you very much for coming, Hans. Please have a seat. Why don't we start, Ajay, with the broad question. You, of course, as previously a minister in the Indian government, had an important role in the whole question of energy efficiency. One of the questions I brought up with Fatih Birol of the IEA this morning was, can India pursue the kind of infrastructure-intensive and to some extent coal-intensive development strategy that has produced enormous prosperity for China but also incredible emissions? Do you see India following that track? Or what have you been doing in areas like LEDs to prevent it from doing that same thing?
Well, the long and the short of it is that for here and now economic reasons, apart from climate reasons, energy efficiency has to pervade every investment that India does. For example, there's a number which is often thrown about that 2/3 of the buildings that will exist in 2030 in India have yet to be built. So if each building that is built tomorrow and the day after is more efficient than the one built yesterday, we are on the right track. Consequently, public policy is important. And in this manner, India and other developing countries are very different from what happens in the OECD countries, where we're really talking about the retirement of high carbon infrastructure and putting it in low or zero carbon infrastructure. Let me give you an example. You talked about LEDs. A few years ago, we decided that we would move all our lighting to LED bulbs. The challenge, of course, was that it costed a huge bit. It was about $6.50 in the market at that time, an LED bulb. And even people like me were not buying it, even though the payback period was 3 years. So what it needed was, as Bert mentioned in the previous panel, a new business model. And the business model we created was a company which went and made contracts with the electricity distribution companies that this new company, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, would get the LED bulbs and give them to the consumers, sell them to the consumers of electricity, and charge them on their bill every month till the money is recovered. As they aggregated this, they went on the other side and did bulk procurement. They did their first bulk procurement. They got these bulbs for about $5. 6 bulk procurements later, the price is about $0.50. And 170 million LEDs have already been sold. Our goal is that we, over the next 2 years, change all the 770 million bulbs in India. Short point, you need to think out of the box. You need new business models. Efficiency can, and for a variety of reasons, including climate change, happens and happens very fast.
Okay. Why don't I change over to a steel question? thyssenkrupp, I guess in the CDP rankings that just came out, shows us one of the best and most efficient steelmakers in the world in terms of carbon efficiency. But is that level of technology applicable and competitive in the kind of developing countries where so much of the steel demand is going to take place? And is it competitive, for example, not just in sort of premium automotive steels and so forth that thyssenkrupp is known for, but in reinforcing bars? I was, for example, at a steel mill a while back in India and got splattered with iron ore and hot iron ore, and it was just the place was very disorganized, and you could see there was no effort to reuse waste gases. There was no effort to do any kind of heat reuse. Are those technologies going to be competitive to be deployed beyond affluent markets like Germany, beyond affluent people's products like automotive steel?
The short answer would definitely be yes. Reason being is, as an industry, we are governed by 2 kinds of laws. The one that actually distinguishes us, depending on your location, is the regulatory laws. What is actually your government putting on the ground? The second one, however, and that in this discussion needs not to be forgot, is just the physical laws of how do we do things. And these laws are the same all around the world. And for that, yes, it is possible. Now, the question certainly is, how do you make it possible? Because just an opportunity existing doesn't mean you actually have grasped it. And here I think, I mean, you've mentioned thyssenkrupp as a steel company. That's true to 30%. 70% is something else. And here being in France, I mean, if you would reduce France to just the baguette, yes, you would have a very important part of the country. But if you were to add the cheese and the glass of wine to it, you would actually have a very interesting situation you would prefer to have to just the baguette. And that exactly is, and that's also behind our CDP success, what we are doing internally. We are looking not just at optimizing the steel production, we are optimizing cross-industry sectors. So we are looking into ways, what can we do, what's currently a waste in the steel industry, the off-gases, how can we use that as a valuable carbon-containing feedstock in the industry? Reason being, and that's, I think, is very important to put into the discussion as well, we should be listening from time to time to linguists here much more than to an engineer or an economist, because for sake of simplicity, we speak about decarbonization, but that's not what's needed. Carbon is not the problem. Using carbon is not the problem. The problem is if out of carbon we have a greenhouse gas that we emit in the atmosphere without doing anything against it. I mean, take myself. If I would free myself of carbon, my doctor would be happy, I would be 10% lighter. That's about the percentage of carbon in the human body. However, my wild guess, not being a medical doctor, is I wouldn't function anymore. And the same is true for industry. Parts of it, as already mentioned, will not function without carbon for a long time. So the question, and I think that's good on the Paris Agreement, is not anymore this race for even higher reduction rates. The issue really is, second half of the century, net carbon zero. That means if we have to emit something, what can we do to counterbalance it? And for that, to come back to the beginning of the question, certainly countries like India have an advantage because there we don't even start from a blank page there, but at least say a quarter or so is still free, while say in Germany we might actually realize we have been writing on both sides of the page already.
So Keith, if I can follow up on that. A few years ago, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in India, with which I was formerly associated, introduced a program in which they mandated that energy-intensive industries such as steel have to reduce the amount of energy they use to produce a ton of steel or cement or many other things over a 3-year period. Well, guess what? The average energy used to produce a ton of steel fell by 10%. Now we are into a second phase where, again, a second set of targets have been provided. Remember, these are existing industries. What it does is it makes the stock better and gives a very clear signal to people who will put up tomorrow's industries, thyssenkrupp, for example, that what we are looking at is something which is far more efficient and provides a more level playing field than if a very, very efficient plant, which is more capital intensive, had to compete with a set of plants which were much less efficient. Point simply is that we are all in the process of learning how we go ahead. We know the final vision. Paris Agreement has been a great thing, and when it comes into force tomorrow, I think we are entering a new world. But what it also tells us is that we need to learn in bite-sized pieces as we go ahead. Keith, if I can continue to one more issue that Hans had raised. You know, as we look to the future, it's I think, useful to break the world up into 3 parts as far as carbon is concerned. And this is something that has come out of the work of the Energy Transitions Commission with a number of people, companies, think tanks, financial institutions apart to look at how we would move to a low-carbon future. And this is first, decarbonize the electricity system, see how we can get more and more renewables. And our work seems to indicate that by 2025, renewable electricity plus battery storage, so that you can provide dispatchable power, should be available at about $70 per megawatt hour. That means there really will be no more investment in fossil fuels beyond that. Second, in those areas where we are not using electricity today, let's try to see how we can increase electrification. Automobiles is clearly one thing. In my country, I believe we will continue to be largely a two-wheeler nation. Two-wheelers, electricity-based two-wheelers are important, as are electric buses. Third, there will continue to be a group where we will not be able to move to electricity. Steel industry. Clearly, energy efficiency is one part, and then doing something with the rest becomes important. Carbon capture, but more importantly, utilization. Can we convert it into things like algae, for example, which can be used as a nutrient? I think those are the areas that we need to look into so that over a 30-year time frame, the innovation cycles can start delivering the kinds of products that in all of these three areas move us to a low or a net zero carbon future.
May I just
Yes, please.
step in perhaps with one point? In principle, I fully agree. As always, the devil is in the details. If we look at energy efficiency, we have to be careful that we don't segment too much. For example, in India, we have one steel plant that produces so-called electrical steel. That's everything you need in a motor and a generator in order to turn electricity into motion or vice versa. Here, certainly, just looking at the efficiency in production could be actually a little bit dangerous, because if you spend a little bit more energy in production, you get much, much more energy efficiency in the use phase. And that, I think, is something I would very much like to advocate about. It is about the system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the future, what do we want? We want a green future. How does it look like? I mean, if you would have a painter painting it, he most probably would have some green hills, and most likely in the middle of it, you would have that majestic tree towering. So that's the green future we are thinking about. And if you speak now to the biologists will tell you, yes, this tree is absolutely great because it has a competitive advantage. It has its leaves closer to the sun than the grass on the ground. However, if you look a little bit closer, what you will find, the reason for that is a brown trunk in the middle of that tree. And that exactly is what I would like to advocate very much about, not trying to distinguish between brown and green industries, good and bad, but to really ensure that for the future we have cross-industry systems that are operational.
Thank you. Why don't we talk a little bit about China, which is such an effective competitor in areas like LED, where you've personally fostered so much in the Indian LED industry. I've been to Chinese LED factories, and partly because of government subsidies, they are lavish, elaborate, highly mechanized, highly automatic operations. Can anybody in these areas of green energy that have so much Chinese government money pouring into them stay competitive?
Well, what we found in the Indian example was that as we enlarged the market, the initial supplies, or at least the components for the supplies, came from China for the reasons that you mentioned. But as the market became more and more competitive, the sheer cost of transportation from China to India became a large enough component to encourage people to manufacture in India. So today, it's only the LED chip that comes from the places where it's made, USA, Korea, etc. The rest of the LED bulb is made in India, but it's made because of competitive reasons. I believe that as we go to markets that become larger, to markets where technical standards are put into place, you will start finding the kind of, horrible word, technical ecosystem, which enables the consumer to get the best value for money.
Okay. One more question, Hans. You have a rare combination of backgrounds, not only in climate policy, but also as an economist, your work at the World Steel Association. Is it feasible to come up with a carbon tax on imports from coal-intensive countries like China, and have it, in particular, be WTO compatible as well?
That's a question that should be answered on so many different levels. I think we would be well running into dinner time. is it feasible means, is it technical feasible? Is it legally feasible? Is it politically feasible? And on all of these, you will get a very different answer. And the problem here is, as always, it is really in the details. We had this discussion, or we are having that discussion at regular intervals every time we rediscuss the European emission trading system of, okay, why don't we just have a border tax around and that's it? And just to give you a few ideas about the scope of issues involved there, starts with what actually gets across your border. You have a ton of steel, and that ton of steel comes, I don't know, in the form of a few bars or some coils. How were you actually able to really put down where does it come from, what's the carbon emission on it, particularly since it goes through a value chain? It's not a single source. Next, most of the imports we see is not really in the forms of base materials, but in the forms of products. So, I mean, if we have a car being delivered into the European Union, you would have to sort of mentally dismantle it and say, okay, the steel of the hood comes from that company, the steel for the engine from a different one because it's a different one. On top of that, you would have to do it for all the different materials and so on and so forth. So you would have huge issues. And just to leave a last one, a lot of politicians would be very uncomfortable with then the rational thing to do if you were to export out of that region. You would be actually having to then get a tax break, get something back, whatever. And that would be very bad reputation. But I think that's something, coming back to the Paris Agreement, we need to be clear about. The discussion has moved on. It is not about the level playing field as we had before Copenhagen, this idea of there's one level for everybody. We have a landscape of very different water levels. However, it's very important that we realize we need to be able to move from the one level to the other, and all of us who work in hydraulic engineering know that locks and that are something we have been working on for a few thousand years. Technically, we are very good at it. Now we have to do it on these systems, but, and that's very important, we will be in a situation where we have that differences for a long time, but still, if we are able to combine that in a good sense, why shouldn't we do it? So it could be that in some instances, to finally try to answer your question at least, in some instances that is one of the instruments, but we will see many instruments are being needed, and we will see in every single situation what's the best one.
Thank you both very much. That's a very clear description of a complex issue. We really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Hans. Liz Alderman will introduce our next panel on business innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Great. Well, I would love to invite our panelists up for our next panel on business innovation. Very pleased to have with us Rob Bernard, who's the Chief Environmental Strategist at Microsoft, Teresa Thompson, the Chief Responsibility Officer at Dell, and Deb Frodel, the Global Executive Director of